Good morning. So just a couple of words covering up what we did not talk about here in class, and of course we won't be able to talk about every single thing here in class. So the book is very straightforward, and whenever you have any questions, send me an email, get in touch with me, and I'll clarify. But the book mentions the difference between code switching and borrowing, and I wanted to just say a few words. This is still talking about the language contact phenomena, which goes back to chapter 4. And you have this. I'll post this PowerPoint on Blackboard anyway, but here you have a little bit of a chart of this comes from an article on Polish-English code switching on Facebook, on language in the language of Polish Facebook. So that's an idea that maybe if you don't know what to do your project on, give a read to an article like this, and you might get some ideas of how you could use even social media for your little projects at the end of the class. Here this chart kind of shows the differences between code switching and borrowing, citing relevant research. So code switching is they list seven differences between code switching and borrowing, because it's at first sight they kind of look like the similar phenomena, and they are similar phenomena. So there is no clear point. It's one of those things that falls on a continuum. That you start as a borrowing, and then you start with the code switching, and when the code switching becomes established so that everyone is using that word, then it has become a borrowing, a word that has been embedded into the lexicon of the borrowing language. And it's a process that has it's difficult to at a moment, any particular moment, say, well, is this a code switching or is it a borrowing? But these give some guidelines, and we're specifically talking. Of course, it's clear that something is code switching if a person says one sentence in one language and another sentence in another language. And that is clearly code switching. It's easy to notice, but if we're talking about insertional code switching, where you take just one word from another language and put it into the language that is the prevalent language of that particular conversation, then it can be a code switch or it can be a borrowing, right? And the criteria to define which it would be are kind of, some of those criteria are laid out here. So we have, for instance, the code switches, they appear before borrowings. If you think about an established borrowing on English has thousands and thousands of words borrowed from French, Latin, Greek, Scandinavian languages, Spanish, a lot of all the languages basically that English has come into contact with. They are they have given borrowings, donated words to English, or English has taken those words without asking, can we take this word and start using it? Because there are other ways of adding to the lexicon than borrowing, but borrowing is really easy. You borrow a concept, and together with the concept you borrow the word itself. So we have. Let me give you an example. For instance, here's the pretty much the only borrowing that English has taken from my first language, which is Finnish, and that's sauna or sauna. Sauna, as we say in Finland, sauna, but sauna in English. So that has become a borrowing. People don't even know what language it comes from typically, and it's used by monolingual speakers of English. But initially, when it was brought here with a concept, with the immigrant people coming from Finland specifically, because the other Scandinavians don't have this kind of concept. So it is a specifically Finnish concept, and it was introduced. The concept was introduced by people who immigrated mostly to the northern states of the United States or Canada, and they brought the concept together. They brought the word, and of course, it's when somebody, an American Finn, Canadian Finn, is speaking Finnish and using this word, it's in Finnish sentences. It's just a Finnish word. But when other people, English speakers, understood the concept, if they didn't adopt the saunas, they at least sometimes needed to talk about them, and they took the word from Finnish that the Finnish Americans, Canadian Finns used, and put that word into an English sentences. Like you could say he's gonna build a sauna, and when maybe the first times it would have been like if bilinguals used it, it could have been seen as a code switch. But then when it became established, it has become a borrowing. So code switches appear before borrowings. Borrowings appear after code switches. Second point, code switches are more restricted when it comes to their use. They are individual, so that if you know any language. Which language have you studied?
French.
Okay, so if you're speaking English and you are in your English utterance, you use a French term, that would be a code switch, but not all your friends are using it. So it would be restricted to your usage. So it's an individual thing. But then when it becomes a borrowing, the borrowings are less restricted in the use. So they become societal. Okay. If we think about an opposite kind of a thing, French has borrowed from English the word weekend, and that was first probably a code switch of a bilingual person who used English and French going back and forth. It was individual probably first, because these things need to be introduced to a language. So they, by definition, they are individual in the beginning, and then it becomes societal. So the point number 3, code switches are completely unadapted, which means that they can be phonologically unadapted. Like if a Finnish American tells his English-speaking neighbor that I am going to build a sauna, so he would pronounce it in Finnish, but then they become these words become phonologically adapted in terms of morphology and phonology when they become societally used. So the neighbor said, oh, you're going to build a sauna. So from sauna it becomes sauna. So phonologically adapted to English. 4, the code switches have a temporary character. They don't get established. They are used haphazardly, so to say, even though code switching itself follows rules, but both grammatical rules or tendencies at least, and rhetorical tendencies. But code switches have a temporary character. Borrowings are established in a language. Like we have borrowed all these words from French, and they have become established so that we don't even think about them as originally French words. Sometimes we kind of like, what is the origin of this word? And you have to go to the Oxford English Dictionary to see what the etymology of the word is. Point number 5, here's the difference between parole and langue. These are terms that when we talk about performance versus competence, these are related, not synonymic, but related terms, and that would be point number 6. So code switches are performance, parole, related, parole, a French term, and they are related to when we are actually using language, but then borrowings, they are related to a person's competence, that a native speaker knows that this word is now an English word and doesn't even think about the origin of that word. So probably the clearest distinction between code switches and borrowings is that code switches can be used by code switches can be used. They are used by bilingual people. By definition, you cannot code switch if you are not, to an extent, bilingual. So you may take some French words because you know French into your English, and you kind of, code switching. You have to have a certain knowledge in order to switch between those languages. But when a word becomes a borrowing, it can be used by monolinguals. So if a French word, if it becomes really entrenched, really introduced into English so that everybody is societally using it, then it has become a borrowing. So this, I just thought to provide this if it's been not completely clear what the difference is, because the end product seems to be pretty much the same, but they really are conceptually two different things. So from a code switch to the borrowing along a continuum. Okay, let's talk more about language variation. This is chapters 6 and 7 in the Wardhaugh and Fuller book, and these are fundamental concepts in sociolinguistics. So the chapter 6 starts from a discussion of regional dialectology, regional variation. And what we did last time here, we were focusing on regional variation when we were listening to all those different speech samples. We were not focusing on so much on a person's gender, whether the speaker was male or female, and the person's age. They were kind of like clues to identify what the match was there between the sample and the listed speech examples, but the main key thing here was regional, in that exercise, was regional variation. So we were thinking about where this person comes from. We left out completely almost completely the social class issue, and we didn't have ethnicity figured in here either. So we were just looking at regional variation. And this is a very established field in sociolinguistics. It used to be pretty much what sociolinguistics was understood to be, say, for instance, in the mid-1900s, 1950s, these regional dialectology studies were very common, very prevalent, and of course all disciplines, they develop so that they start from something and then it kind of goes to other directions and adds to the understanding of the field. So regional dialectology, it was really a very good way to start, but we can talk about what problems focusing only on the region, it's problematic, of course, because there are so many other things that are going on. Like, for instance, is it a female or a male speaker, or something in between? Is it an older, younger speaker, or something in between? Is it an upper class speaker, middle class speaker, working class speaker, lower class speaker? These are the terms that linguists have borrowed from sociology in order to explain some correlations of language variation, because it ends up being an explaining factor. But if you just look at, okay, you come from this region and you will be speaking this way, it's in a way, it's a simplistic way of approaching the thing, but it's a very good way of approaching language variation, because we immediately hear, like last time we did heard these speech samples, that's what we focus on. Where does that person come from? He speaks a little bit differently. So in the next slide, here is, how does this show? Can you see anything of that? So here we have a map which is called a linguistic atlas, a dialect map, and this comes from 1953, and that's when the time when these maps were drawn. It was their way of approaching sociolinguistics, language variation. So in this particular map, we're looking at the past tense variation in the past tense forms of the verb to see. And of course, it's in standard English, it is saw. I see him, I saw him yesterday. But in the eastern states, in the 1950s, it was possible to hear 3 different past tense forms for the verb see. So instead of saying that using the standard, I saw him yesterday, people could say, I seen him yesterday, I see him yesterday, or I seed him yesterday. Obviously, these are non-standard forms because these were not used in like written and formal contexts, but interesting forms anyway. And how are these distributed in the eastern states then? So in order to study something like this, you have to travel a lot and interview people and make notes of what the form is that they use. And of course, we always then have the methodological questions. Is this a reliable study and a valid study? So are we taking a large enough sample? Can we generalize to anything from this study? And we're not looking at the specifics on, based on which these dialect atlases were drawn, but we're just kind of like basically looking at these are the kinds of things you can find out. And then you have to ask, how many people were interviewed? Was it a representative sample of the entire population? In what kind of a situation would they use these forms, and what regional dialectology that focuses only on regional variation of a particular linguistic token, a linguistic variable, lexical variable, then we don't really know whether one particular person is using always this non-standard form, like I seen him. So we don't know about that, and those are the problems which I've listed here. So problems with drawing dialect atlases, it is a problem because everybody, as we will see, everybody and have seen, we've talked about this already, everybody changes the way he or she speaks depending on the situational factors. But anyway, let me introduce the term isogloss. When you collect these data and draw these little little dots or little triangles to indicate whether the form that you have recorded from that particular speaker was see, seen, see, or seed. Then you have this map where you have to kind of like see that, okay, in the northern parts of the eastern states, what seems to be the form that is used there? Can you?
Looks mostly like see and seen.
Yes, exactly. See and seen. So the black dots and the white dots indicate seen and see. So it seems that in New York State, the commonest seems to be, of course, based on the numbers and so on, but it seems to be the form C. What about Vermont, which is way up there, and Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Maine? What seems to be the most prevalent? If you just look at Vermont, North Hampshire, and Maine, way up there, the northern New England states.
Mostly seen.
It's seen, yes. I seen him. Mm-hmm. And then you come down to Massachusetts and you are introducing in certain parts of Massachusetts seed. I seed him. And so this is very interesting, but at some point you have to draw a line. Like here we have, this would be state lines, but the state line does not coincide necessarily with a form. So you have to kind of like draw around the forms, leaving the totally isolated cases that are just like standing out as one case of some particular form. You leave those out, but where there's a cluster, you draw a what is called an isogloss. And we can do that here in this map, for instance. You can identify. Let's go further down to North Carolina. What seems to be the situation there? What forms are used?
Looks like all of them are, but mostly seed.
Yes, and then if you want to draw, if you look at the coastal area of North Carolina and Virginia, what seems to be kind of like used there?
See.
See, exactly. So so you could draw a line around the black dots here to indicate that, okay, in this area in Virginia and North Carolina, C is used by many speakers as a variant of saw. So that line that we draw around these variants, that would be called an isogloss. But isogloss in itself does not indicate that this is a dialect boundary, because a dialect is not only one particular form that is used. It coincides typically with many different forms, not only the lexical form, like where do people say soda, where do they say pop. We could draw a line there, but that doesn't necessarily yet make a dialect boundary. You have to have other isoglosses. When you have a bundle of these isoglosses, a lot of differences, like there's a morphological difference between these speakers, there's a phonological difference, people pronounce certain vowels differently, and then they use this morphological form, either seen or see or seed, instead of saw. If you have many of these isoglosses, then only then can we talk about a dialect boundary. So let's see if, not sure if this is going to work. Anyway, no.
You have to hit control and then click it.
I'll probably copy and paste it, but I'm gonna. Oh, control and click. Thank you. No potential security concerns. Yes, thank you. Thank you. I have such a pessimistic view. We're not doing a survey of the British Library now. All right, so this is a page that, and you can, look at this more at your leisure. So, so this is a page to those resources that they list at the beginning. This link at the beginning of the book to the URL, where you also have summaries of the chapters of each chapter and questions and key words of the chapter. So this link comes from there, from that website. So it's kind of like supplementary website to, the companion website. This is where you have the URL where you can find all these wonderful resources. So this is we listened to those American dialects and last time, or accents, and here we have accents from different parts of Britain. So let's see if this opens up. This is the received pronunciation, which is the standard Queen's English received pronunciation, or BBC English, and so you can listen to, you can read about that a little bit more, and you can listen to sound recordings. So we've got 77 results. Oh, these are back to the sound recordings from all the different, many different parts of the world. Let's listen if this works. Again, I'm being pessimistic. Bangor is in Wales. So in Western England.
Household, I assume you then speak English?
No. My dad took to Welsh as if he was a natural. My dad speaks fluent Welsh.
Really?
Unbelievable. Just picked it up.
That's very unusual.
Yeah, just picked it up as if, Yeah. He got a job with a firm called Purple Motors after he'd passed his PSV, and after he finished national service, he got a job. He passed.
Okay, so that would be a Welsh accent. I have a colleague here who did his PhD in Bangor, and he sounds very much like that. So, so a Scottish accent, and there are different regions there also. So, beautiful pictures.
And the guy in the afternoon shift, they called him the bath attendant, he looked over after the showers, he was off. So what they had to do, in a big bit they could just put somebody else with the surface, but they bring an old timer up. And this was an old worker that had brought up the pit to look after the baths. Now
anyway, so you can play with this website and listen to the different parts of different kinds of English dialects. So I'm going to leave it here on this PowerPoint, so you can try it out. It's kind of fascinating to listen to English from different parts of the world. And when you first hear like the Scottish accent, you're like, what language is this? But then you start hearing, and the more we are exposed to different kinds of dialects, the easier it is to, or accents, actually, these are just the, accent samples. Of course, there are these other variables also. So what is a linguistic variable? A linguistic variable is a linguistic item that has variants, identifiable variants. And the example that is often used, and we have already mentioned here, is the suffix ing, ing, written in written English, and that has two variants. This is so ing is a linguistic variable, and it has two variants. You can either pronounce it as like singing, and it's the pronunciation of the last two letters, alphabet letters, which are used to indicate just one sound. So ng in English it doesn't mean that we pronounce it sin, ging. It's not ng, it's pronounced as ng. However, it can also be pronounced as singin, and with an N. So in writing we indicate it then as if the G has been dropped, but of course we're not even pronouncing it as a G, let alone the name of the letter G. G dropping, it's referred to colloquially as G dropping when you say singing. He was singing, and it's just a change between the which is both are nasal sounds. This is a velar nasal, and this is an alveolar nasal. So you produce these nasals in a different place. You produce this at the soft palate, velum, and this one you produce at the alveolar ridge. The tongue is touching the alveolar ridge behind the teeth. So versus and these are the two variants. So there have been a lot of sociolinguistic studies trying to map up what is going on. Who are the people who are more likely to use when other people use So it's produced a lot of studies. Here is one study done by William Labov, and these are the correlational studies, the first wave of language variation studies in sociolinguistics, where you're looking at how a person says something and what does that correlate with. So this is a study we've talked about, William Labov and his study of the R linguistic variable, whether people have the R in the words like fourth, floor, or not. And so the variance would be the pronunciation of the and not pronouncing it. So versus 0 variant. And here this study by Labov is also in New York City, and what it's showing is a lot of things. It's showing that he usually uses the social classes: lower class, working class, lower middle class, and upper middle class as a tool to understand the variation of these linguistic variables. So again, how is this distributed in pronunciation versus ing, as in working, talking, as opposed to working, talking? Okay, and we have intuitions about this, and we can listen to ourselves. We can listen to people we speak with, and we can come up with some kind of a hypothesis. And the hypothesis probably would be that if you are giving a lecture in class or giving an oral presentation in a class, you're probably going to use more of these variables than the variables. But when you're chatting with your friends in a very casual situation, then you would be more likely to use this. Now, how does this then relate to the social stratification from the class structure that Labov has, imposed on the speakers in his samples, and he does that because it is an explanatory factor, as we can see here. So he divided, again, like in the department store study, he divided the situation basically in a very simple but insightful manner. Like you're first asking the shop attendant, where are men's ties? And he knew that they are on 4th floor, so he first asked and then made a note of what people say in the first answer, and then, I'm sorry, I didn't hear it, and then they said it again, so when they say it more carefully the second time, there was a change. They had more R's. So what happens with and pronunciations is a similar kind of a thing. It is, if we think about the linguistic variable this here, then it has two variants, this one and this one. So a variable, linguistic variable, in this case, it has two variants. And who are more likely to use what in what situation? That's what Labov was interested in. So what, if you look at that chart, what are the broad generalizations that you can make there? So depending on the situation, here they are at the bottom: casual speech when people are just chatting with the interviewer, careful speech when they are, for instance, answering formal interview questions, that would be careful speech, and reading style, if I give you a passage, please read this, then you that's a third kind of situation. So how does the pronunciation, so here we have the percentages of the usage of in, this variant of the linguistic variable. What kind of a generalization can you make here, depending on the situation?
Well, in all three versions of speaking, the lower classes tend to use it more than the upper classes.
Exactly. That's when the class here is the dependent variable. I'm sorry, the independent variable. So this linguistic variable is the dependent variable, the independent variable, and then you have, what does it depend on? It depends on the class, and then within the class, it also depends on the situation of whether it's casual, careful, and reading style speech. So that if I give you a question like this, if you knew that a particular resident of New York City pronounced ing as in, if the person used this variant, 30% of the time, if you know this. So if a resident of New York pronounces ing as in, about 30% of the time in some situation, but you didn't know which situation it was. Could you explain why you would or would not have a basis for deciding or having the information of which of the four socioeconomic status group the person belongs to? So 30% of the time a person says in, so it's like they're between upper middle class and lower class.
I mean, if those are the three options, you have a 66% chance of being right if you choose lower middle class. the other third is lower class in reading style, but
Yes. So yeah. So if 30%, what is the only class that you can rule out that this person doesn't belong to?
upper middle.
Exactly. So other than that, you don't know whether the person belongs to lower middle class, working class, or lower class, because all those social classes at one style will use about 30% of in uses. So only upper middle class doesn't use 30% of that. What if we say the same thing, that a person from New York is using in 70% of the time? Can we now know more about the social class?
It has to be lower class.
Yes, it has to be, because if you lift it up 70%, you go between 60 and 80, and it's only lower class who would be pronouncing it 70% of the time. So these are fascinating findings in a sense that because people have these hunches that the use of in, this person speaks like a particular class representative or member. And what is our hunch based on? It's based on this kind of variation, that it's not totally random, even though what we want to emphasize is that all social classes change the way they speak depending on the speech situation. Okay, so if this is a linguistic variable and it has two variants, then what others are there? We already talked about the or variable, as in for and form, which has two variants: the pronunciation of or, what I just said, or zero. So you can say fa or fawn, right? And that is variation that correlates with region, social class, and situation. Okay. The T variable is also something that has been studied quite a bit. So the word butter, we can, if I pronounce it as butter, and that's the only word a person hears from me, and then somebody asks, where does she come from? America or UK? So what would be the answer? Butter. It would be the American pronunciation, right? And that is what is indicated here with like an R without the pedestal under here. So it's like this kind of this is international phonetic alphabet that we have to use. Or what linguists use when they talk about the phonological variation, because the spelling system doesn't do the job here. So of course you can say butter as butter, and or butter. So that would be so t is one pronunciation, butter or butter, the American pronunciation, clear regional division there. So another T variable is in the word like button, which can be pronounced as what I just said, but if you speak like in an informal situation, you might say button, and that would be using a glottal stop, another international phonetic alphabet symbol, which is like a question mark without a dot underneath. So so you can say button or button. What does that correlate with? Is it speech situation? Is it region? Is it social class? Probably very often the speech situation, but it could be also social class, button, in certain parts of the world. Then there's the TH variable, as in the word mouth, you can say it with the interdental fricative, which the IPA symbol for which is a theta. So mouth, interdental fricative, tongue between the teeth, that's why it's interdental. But it can be pronounced also, and is pronounced with an F, right? So mouth, put the spoon in your mouth, right? And what does that correlate with? So, so we have some non-standard dialects where it's regularly, the is very often pronounced as the F. Okay, and if you check out the book on page 149, you will find more examples of linguistic variables. So a linguistic variable is what we are looking at as the dependent variable, and then it correlates with certain constructs, social constructs or regional constructs or what have you. So we already mentioned something about methodology when doing regional dialectal studies, when drawing these dialect atlases. Of course it matters if you ask one person, how do you pronounce this the past tense form of see? Is it saw or seen or seed or see? You don't have a reliable study. You have to ask a lot of people. And what would be then statistically significant? These sociolinguists who drew these dialect atlases, they made sure that this is a significant finding. So it's not just one person saying it. And then, but then, what is important also is the notion of accountability when we study a linguistic variable and its distribution across speakers and situations and so on. So the principle of accountability is that if it's possible that we need to take care of this by looking at the distribution in all possible contexts that we are looking at. So if it's possible to define a variable as a closed set of variants, and all these variables that we have been looking at have closed sets of variants. But you have to look at all the variants and include also the non-occurrence variants as if it's relevant. Everything must be counted. So this is the definition directly from your book. If it is possible to define a variable as a closed set of variants, in other words, whether a person is using an R or not in farm or farm, then you have to include also when it's not pronounced, obviously. So if you have a recording of half an hour of a research participant, you have to look at the places, all the words that have potentially an R, and how many times does the person pronounce that R, and how many times does the person not pronounce that R. So you count both, all must be counted. If you are looking at another kind of a linguistic variable, like the multiple negation, for instance, I don't have no money, or I never have no money, I don't never have no money, many different possibilities. Then you have to look at all the sentences that have a negation and see whether a person is using a standard negation, I don't have any money, or if they use the non-standard, I don't have no money. Okay, so you would look at all the sentences that could possibly have the double negation. Okay, so these have what we have been looking at, the linguistic variants, the linguistic variables. They have a closed set of variants, so you either say this, or sometimes you may have 3 or even 4 variants. But there are also those linguistic variables that have variation of degree, that you can't say it's either pronouncing the or not pronouncing the or. Like, for instance, nasalization is something when we pronounce a vowel in a nasal kind of a manner. And so on. It's a matter of degree. How nasalized is it? Or is it a little bit nasalized or more nasal? So we have a continuum. We cannot say it's either done or not done. The pronunciation of vowels is another thing that is a variation that shows the variation of a degree. I'll give you a very simple example of variation of the pronunciation. In a word like bath or bath. So a clear regional difference here. In America we say bath, right? And again, another international phonetic symbol, it's called an ash. This indicates the a. It's a low front vowel. And in Britain, it would be ah. So this is a front low vowel, this is a low back vowel. And of course there's a continuum between those two, so any particular person could say something in between, so the tongue would be not in the very front ah position and not in the very back ah position, but somewhere like ah. And so that would be a very simple example of the variation according to degree, and this makes the study more complicated, obviously. That's why most of the studies, sociolinguistic studies of variation, of a phonological variation, is done on a closed set of variants, because it's either or, but here it's a continuum, a potential continuum. Okay. What makes these studies kind of insightful, interesting, also is that in certain linguistic environments, a certain variant might be more likely than another one. So an example would be the pronunciation of these two words as opposed to these two words. So if we look at the pronunciation of the vowel here, how would you read these two words?
Sin and send.
Yes, so you have a different vowel there. In the International Phonetic Alphabet, you would indicate this with an E, sin, and here, it's not a minimal pair, because sin wouldn't be an English word, but this phonetic environment here is the same. So the linguistic environment is an S in front and an N following. So that provides the environment. And in this environment, the pronunciation is different. But how would you pronounce these two words?
Pen and pen.
You have different vowels there as well. You have pen and pen, and that is, I don't want to say that it's necessarily a standard way of pronouncing it, but you probably know people for whom these words sound the same. So where's my pen? Where's my pen? Right? And this is this is something that is defined by the fact that it's in front of a nasal, but also it follows, so that the linguistic environment is slightly different. I don't know if there are any people who would hear say sin and send me, they may say send me. You know some people.
Like a few, but I don't know if it's like a prominent thing.
Send me the information. Yeah, it is. And okay, so here it is the nasal following E and A that provides the linguistic environment where these different pronunciations may collapse to an E. But if we take a set of words, this is a minimal pair, where it's not an N after the E and A, then these are kept separate, right? So I don't know anyone who would say sit and set in the same way, using the same vowel. So the phonological environment also affects which variant is going to be used, which is another very interesting thing to kind of look at. What's in what phonological situation. So we've been underscoring that everybody changes the way everybody speaks in different situations, and also there's variation according to social class, ethnicity, region, and so on. So the situational factors and demographic factors influence which variant people use. But that may also be dependent on the linguistic environment. So where in the word when we're talking about phonological variation. Okay, so in sociolinguistic interviews, it's important to do the sampling so that we get a representative sampling, so that we can have some sort of generalizability from the study, that it's not just like these people just happen to be picked up and they just happen to be saying things that way. But in order to make generalizations, you have to do the sampling very carefully. There are apparent time studies, which are often done because they are easier to do so. At the same time, you get, if you're, for instance, interested in whether there has been a change in the pronunciation, that older people use a different variant of a linguistic variable than younger people, then you can do an apparent time study and take a group of 20 people in their 20s and a group of people, same size group of 50 people in their 40s, and a third group of people, 50 people from their 60s, and you compare these three different groups at the same, of the data that has been collected at the same time, okay? But the real-time study would mean that you collect data from the same people, if this is a panel study, from the same people at different times. So in order to see, if we're doing the first kind of an apparent time study, and we can ask the same question, like, has the pronunciation of pin and pen in Texas, has it changed over 40 years? Okay, so we take 20-year-olds, 40-year-olds, and 60-year-olds at the same time, and then make an assumption that the 60-year-olds are representing an earlier pronunciation, maybe, but anyway. But in a real-time study, you have to wait 40 years in order to, if you want to use the same people for instance, like in a panel study. So this year, if you're interested in doing a study of any linguistic variable here in Texas, you would interview 100 people and then interview them 20 years after that, and then 40 years after the initial study. So you could do it, but some of your research participants might die in between, or some may move so that it's difficult to reach. So real-time studies of the same people, these panel type of studies, are rarely done, even though Labov himself is still involved. He's studying the vowel shifts in the northern states, among other things that he's doing, and he's been following up with the same people. Of course, he has a lot of other people working with him. So they, at a regular interval, they contact the same people, for instance, in Detroit or some other large cities, and get together and record them. And what he's noticing, that he's been doing this for decades now, so what he's noticing that there's a shift in how people are pronouncing certain vowels, and he can confidently say that because he's been following the same people, recording them decade after decade, and is noticing this change. So it's really, really fascinating. But obviously, if you're writing your master's thesis or dissertation, you can't afford to wait 40 years to collect your data, interesting as the findings may be. So sometimes the trend, real-time studies, trend studies, is that if you want to look at is there a change in certain language usage, in 10 years you would record people now, and after 10 years, if you didn't get the same people, you could use a trend study and record other people, different people, and then extrapolate from those data that there may have been a change or may not. So interesting ways of approaching this. So indicators, markers, and stereotypes. First of all, what is an indicator? Indicator is a linguistic variant that doesn't have a lot of social stigma or non-stigma attached to this linguistic variant. Like if you for instance say yes, it's true that bath and bath are two different variants of pronouncing the vowel in those words, but it doesn't have any linguistic stigma in Britain versus in America. You would just sound like a foreigner if you go to Britain and say, you would sound like an American if you say bath. Where's the bathroom? They would notice you're a foreigner, but there's no linguistic stigma attached to that particular pronunciation. And the same thing if a Brit comes here, where's the bathroom? Or anyway, they would probably ask for the loo or the toilet or something. Anyway, restroom is an American word as well. Okay, so an indicator here is the pronunciation a or a. You're either a British person or an American person, but that doesn't have social value. There's no stigma in that pronunciation. Whereas there may be some stigma in some pronunciations, like for instance, and then this is a marker. Marker carries social information, that you come from a particular class of speakers, and it may be a stigmatized pronunciation. Like if you always say in, like I'm going golfing, I'm going fishing, I'm going hunting, then you're kind of like marking yourself. There's a little, not much stigma, but a little bit of stigma in that pronunciation. But if you use ain't, for instance, there's a lot of stigma to that. if you don't use it as a just like a joke, in the middle of a lecture, I might say, "Oh, we ain't got no time to do this anymore." Or to do this no more. Double negatives, they have some stigma. So they are markers of a particular class. And keep in mind that the markers may have covert prestige. Like if you use ain't, you may be speaking a non-standard dialect, which in itself has covert prestige within the speakers, but not outside in the society as a whole, which looks at overt prestige associated with standard varieties. So we don't have time for this, but think about whether there are stereotypes, or if something comes to your mind right away, are there stereotypes about the variety that you speak?
Unfortunately, I don't exactly speak one variety.
Yes.
Because, as I've said in previous class, I have a speech impediment, and so it doesn't line up with where I was raised.
Yeah. Okay.
I know people make generalizations about my dad's accent, which isn't even very heavy.
Yeah. Is he from Texas?
He's from East Texas.
Okay.
So a lot of people think, specifically East Texas, it's dumber and less educated. So.
Yes, and that is a horrible stereotype, which is totally without any cause. But it is a stereotype, and if you watch that American Tongues video, there are a lot of stereotypes that we can see that are going Texas is a place where people speak slowly, and that means that they might be slow themselves, which ain't true. So anyway, it's interesting, and it's stereotypes. They are brought by these markers that carry social information. Okay, back to the different kinds of variables. Correlation studies. The correlation studies look for dependent and independent variables, and the correlation between those two. So the linguistic variable is a dependent variable, which depends on these independent variables, or may depend on independent variables like social class, age, gender, ethnicity, speech situation, and so on. So correlation studies look at the connections between a linguistic variable, which depends on an independent variable. And then we're back to the three waves of variation studies. The correlation studies specifically, they are the first wave of sociolinguistic studies, and they are very often we started with the regional dialect atlases and so on, and then Labov came and he initiated actually this first wave of qualitative studies of language variation with his huge monumental work. I better write his name here, but it appears in all sociolinguistics books. He's has been extremely influential with his work. So his work, initial work, was the social stratification of English in New York City, and he did all these department store studies and the in versus ing studies and multiple more studies. So the studies that follow this first wave tradition, they use survey or quantitative methods to examine the relation between the linguistic variable and major demographic category, like class, age, sex, ethnicity. And the results of these studies, they have been combined to develop the big picture of the social spread of sound change, for instance, where the socioeconomic hierarchy figures as a map of social space, and change happens also. We haven't talked much about the change, but the change, according to these studies, seems to be driven by the middle class who wants to sound like upper class. And then the second wave studies are the network studies. They rely on ethnographic information. You look at networks and how a network can maybe additionally explain how people speak, because tense networks tend to be often like working class networks, where people, dense networks, where people, my neighbor is also my colleague at work, we work at the same factory, or we are also married to relatives and we go fishing together. So a very dense network, and that often explains covert prestige. And then we have this third wave of identity studies, where the way people speak is a marker of what they want, what kind of a message they want to send of themselves, or what they are doing in any particular speech situation. And that's where we'll finish today. Thank you.